Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Liszt Institute, a warm welcome to you to Hungary House. My name is Lilla Farkas, and I'll be the host of tonight's conversation with David Szalay. I don't recall that any of our events sold out so quickly as this one, so that is a good indicator about the anticipation that surrounded this evening. We're here to celebrate an extraordinary book, Flash, which follows István, a Hungarian man whose life carries him from a housing estate in Hungary into very different social worlds, including London, of course. This is a book that places the body itself at the center of the reading experience, inviting us to pay close attention to what is being said, what is being withheld, and to the ways the life is shaped as much by circumstance as by choice. It's a particular pleasure to welcome David. The author of Flash, David Szalay, is a Hungarian-British writer whose fiction is admired for its stylistic elegance, precision, and unsparing insight into contemporary life. Born in Canada and raised in London, he has built a major international reputation. His works move fluently across borders while examining intimacy, masculinity, class, and the quiet pressures of modern life. He has published several acclaimed books, including London and the Southeast, Spring, The Innocent, All That Man Is, Turbulence, and finally Flash. All That Man Is was shortlisted for one of the most important global prizes for fiction, the Booker Prize in 2016, and Flash went on to win the Booker in November 2025. I'm equally delighted to welcome His Excellency Ferenc Kumin, Hungary's ambassador to the United Kingdom. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us this evening and for supporting a cultural life that brings together readers from across London and beyond, including many in the Hungarian diaspora. I think it was a little over a year ago that Flash first appeared here in the UK, and it was around this time last year that we first began talking about holding this conversation here at the Institute. In the meantime, of course, the book's popularity has shown no sign of waning. It will appear in Hungarian later this May, and unless I'm mistaken, David, this is your first appearance before a largely Hungarian audience to speak about Flash.
It is, yes.
All that remains for me to say then is a quick word about tonight's format. Rather than a standard author interview, we're trying to something closer to a triangulated conversation. The structure will be simple. David will read for about 7 minutes, then we'll talk for around 30 minutes, and we'll finish with time for a few audience questions. And if you bought your copy of the book tonight, there will be time to have it signed by the author. And if you didn't, you'll have the chance to buy a copy thanks to our partner, Primrose Hill Books. So David, thank you again for being here. Would you please read for us? The floor is yours.
There's some sort of hold-up. Every day they expect to fly out, and every day they are told it will be another 24 hours. They're staying in a hotel with a swimming pool. They spend most of the day next to the pool. It's not really hot enough for swimming. It's not quite pool weather. It's like 24 or something. Still, they spend most of the day at the poolside. There isn't anything else to do. The plastic sun loungers next to the pool face those towers. Those 3 towers that look like spikes pointing at the sky, with a few blue spheres impaled on 2 of them. He opens his eyes and sees them there, in the middle distance, pointing at the empty sky. Usually in the afternoon, a sort of light sleep comes. Sounds in a spaceless world take on an abstract quality. Sparrows, a passing helicopter, voices at different distances, something else, he isn't sure what. Sparrows. He opens his eyes and finds things different. The shadows in different places, the quality of the light not quite the same, softer, more opalescent, and part of the pool in the shade, making the water there look flat and deep. You want to have your last swim while the sun still has enough strength to warm you up again afterwards. So at around 4, he stands up and approaches the edge of the pool. For a while he lingers there with a sad feeling. Then he dives in, and the water sloshes and swallows in the drains at the side. They have these vouchers they can use in the hotel restaurant, which is always a buffet. They eat all their meals there. There's a weird selection of things. What there isn't is alcohol. There isn't any alcohol anywhere. Once or twice they go out into the city. There isn't anything to do there, so they soon return to the hotel. In the evening there's the sound of the mosques or whatever. They start up all over the place, not at exactly the same time, but sort of overlapping, so that the overall effect is slightly chaotic. There's something about it that he likes, though. The air seems to vibrate. When they stop, it's not all at exactly the same time either. They drop out one by one until there's only one left, and then that one stops too, and it's almost dark, and you can hear the sound of the swifts, the shrieks, as they zoom around with what seems like incautious speed in the lingering twilight. Quite often he's sitting outside at that point, smoking a cigarette, with the swifts shrieking in the air around him. They skim the surface of the pool, he notices, taking a drink. It must taste horrible. The water is strongly chlorinated. He stubs out his cigarette in one of the sand-filled ashtrays and takes the lift up to the 4th floor. He and Norby are sharing a room. Most of the prostitutes in Kuwait are from Southeast Asia. At supper on Thursday, word goes round that they'll be flying out tonight. They pack their stuff and wait in the lobby, still half expecting to be told that it was a false alarm. That has already happened twice. Buses arrive, though. There's a murmur of excitement when they see them through the front of the hotel, these 2 white buses, with nothing on them to identify whose they are. For quite a long time after that, nothing happens. The buses just wait there, with their Pakistani drivers smoking next to them. Then finally the major arrives, and they board the buses, which set off through the mild, quiet streets of the city. Facing them from the front, holding onto 2 seats to maintain his balance, the major says that they're on their way to Ali Al Salem. They won't be flying home, though. He tells them that they'll be flying to Ramstein Air Base in Germany. From there, there'll be transport to Tata. I'm sorry, lads, he says, over their disappointed voices. At least we're going home tonight. There's some problem with the plane, though. It doesn't leave until the next morning. They spend the night lying on the floor at Ali Al Salem, using their packs as pillows. There's a table with sandwiches wrapped in plastic, baskets of Mars and Snickers bars, glass bottles of soft drinks and tokens for the coffee machine. There's also a cigarette machine. Using his last Kuwaiti coins with their Arabic writing and pictures of sailboats, he buys a few packs to take home. It's already mid-morning when they walk across the asphalt to the plane. The plane is painted pale grey and, like the buses, doesn't have any markings on it to show whose it is. It's an American plane, though. They know that. For one thing, there are Americans on it too. They mostly arrive in the morning, the Americans, looking like they've had a proper night's sleep. They're noisy and high-spirited. Where are you guys from? One of them asks. Hungary, István says. Oh yeah, the American says. Yeah, István says. With their heavy packs, they walk across the asphalt to the waiting plane. It's slightly cloudy. When the sunshine filters through, it's soft. If the weather here was always like this, it would be okay. They leave their packs on the asphalt to be loaded and walk up the metal steps. There isn't allocated seating. It's a free-for-all. He sits with Norby and Balázs, and they talk about the night out they're planning to have when they get home. It's something they've been planning for a long time now, something they've sort of promised themselves. This massive night out, their first night home. He sleeps on the plane. He wakes up and looks around. Everything seems exactly the same as it did when he fell asleep. Most of the others are sleeping too. From somewhere there's the sound of music leaking out of headphones. More than half of the window blinds are pulled down, including the one next to him. He lifts it a little. Strong light pushes in so that it's painful, and he slides the blind down again. It's impossible to tell from the quality of the light what time of day it is, wherever they are. It is day, though, and not night, even though it feels like it should be night. Thank you.
So, thank you, David. Before this event, I spoke to your translator, Hungarian translator, András Barabás, about what it was like to translate these sentences, these sparse sentences into Hungarian. And he said that the greatest challenge was the repeated use of these declarative simple present phrases like he says, she says, which is obviously a very conscious stylistic choice. He felt like he was dancing on eggshells because he had to preserve those small constructions, but without flattening it. But at the same time, he also said that the viewpoint of both the Hungarian and English sections was familiar enough so that no cultural code switching was required. So I guess my question would be, was Flash conceived as a between two countries novel from the start, or when did you know that you were writing this book?
I think it was quite deliberately conceived like that. As you know, I grew up in London and lived here for most of my life until I was in my mid-30s, I guess. And then I spent many years in Hungary, the country of my father's birth, and I'd been living in Hungary already for quite a few years when I started work on this book, and I very consciously wanted to write a book that had both an English and a Hungarian aspect to it, I think, because I don't speak Hungarian, or if I speak it in a very limited way indeed. So that I guess more than anything else, that means that I will never feel entirely at home, or sort of in Hungary. I will always be somewhat of an outsider. But also by then, because I'd been living away from London and from this country for so many years, I had started to feel a slight sense of losing touch in a way with this country, or not being a sort of full native of this country either by that time. So that sort of sense of being stretched or divided between two countries was something that I very much wanted to write about, and the two countries specifically being this one and Hungary, England and Hungary. And yes, so the character of István in the book was really conceived partly as a way of writing about that experience of life, of feeling sort of not entirely at home in either country that you're sort of associated with.
Well, stretched between two countries.
Yes, and normally I don't participate in this conversation, but as I told you when we met this afternoon, I'm a big fan of the book, and I guess this book is something that is perfectly fit for a diplomat, because we have also these gray zones of our lives, being raised in Hungary but living here, and there's many aspects of the Flash that resonates very well with our own experiences. But going back a little bit to your Hungarian period of your life that you just alluded on to. Tell us a little bit about what it was like for someone who was raised in London, but you ended up in Pécs, not in Budapest, because Budapest is probably not that much of a cultural shock for someone who was raised in London. But Pécs is a small settlement, or smaller, and how could you gather all these feelings that you reflect on in the Flash? Of a life that is very modest. István's upbringing is very modest, in a very modest family, block houses. How could you gather all these experiences? Did you have a chance to talk to these people oftentimes?
Well, I mean, my father was born and grew up in Pécs. He left Hungary as an adult, I mean a young adult, but an adult in his 20s. And he has 3 sisters and a brother who all remained in Hungary. And obviously his parents, while they were alive, were there too. So I and my family visited Hungary from the 1970s. I mean, I think the first time that I went to Hungary was in something like 1978. And I have cousins who grew up in Pécs, and some of them have spent their whole lives there. One of them now lives in London and is kind of completely established herself here. And so that life in Pécs of course, I was always, I was there as a visitor during those childhood visits, during childhood holidays. But it laid down a kind of that sort of childhood memories, which are very vivid and very intense and really become part of who you are. And so my memories of Pécs from those times, are of that sort. And then, when I went to live in Pécs, I didn't really realize that that's what I was doing. I thought I would only go for a few months, but I ended up staying for some years. And so during that time, obviously, I did know people who, I mixed with people. Pécs is not, it has as you may know, it has quite a large student population of international students. But besides that, it's not a very sort of cosmopolitan melting pot kind of place. It's very, very Hungarian. And so obviously I had a lot of friends and, knew many people whose entire lives were based in about Pécs. And so I think, I did get this feel for it. And then the kind of, the combination of those two things, sort of having access to families on a family level, knowing people as family who lived there. And then when I was there myself, meeting other people, which sort of created a wider context of the place, meant that, while always to some extent an outsider, I think I have quite a deep feel for the place in some ways.
Well, turning to a bit of a more literary question, as your translator also remarked, you create a lot of detail through the texture of the experienced world through the eyes of István, and that's part of why the book feels so relatable to Hungarians, I think, because we see the world through the eyes of this extremely hollowed out man, István, and you take his wordlessness quite far to the point where he almost feels dull, like so foreign, like maybe it's a lack of language skills on his behalf. Did you have, but like we also don't know what he looks like because you never describe him.
True, yes.
Did you have an external image of him in your head while you were writing the book, or was this lack of words designed to emphasize his foreignness? Because No, it's just that because I really feel that to some people he just feels rather like a flat personality.
I'm not sure I would see him as a flat personality exactly. The things you say about him are true, and he's not described. He's not verbally articulate. He is quite an opaque character to the reader. Particularly, I guess, compared with other protagonists of novels who often, there's a lot of explanation somehow in the novel of who they are and what, that was something that I wasn't really particularly doing in this book. But I did have a strong sense of who he was. And it's funny how it works with novels, with fiction as an art form, that I can have a very strong sense of the character without, for instance, knowing what he looks like. That's somehow not necessarily that important in terms of forming this strong non-visual sense of who the person is. And by the same token, I think that I don't really see István as someone hollow in that sense. I don't think the fact that often we don't get much direct information about his sort of emotional and intellectual life doesn't mean that there is none. I hope that he comes across as a character who does have an inner life, certainly someone who has intense emotions. But yeah, as I say, the book wasn't really meant to be an analysis of him as a person in that way. And it was more about, partly about the kind of physicality of existence and partly about the way in which life is created by external forces, which the individual doesn't really have much control over and is subject to, whether they like it or not. So, I think that I wouldn't describe him as a hollow character exactly, but he's certainly somewhat unknowable.
Can we stay for a minute with the personality of István and the character of
István?
Sure, yeah. Because again, it correlates very well to the experience of a London-based Hungarian diplomat, because István could very easily be a consular case. Although it has never come across to me any similar person. But I really want, because he's such a well-described person, even though we don't know how he looks like. But can I ask if there was anyone in your experiences throughout your London years when you met expats, Hungarians, those who came in the early 2000s or anything like that, because we know these members of the Hungarian community here, and of course that is also why this book and this novel is very important, because you deal with a phenomenon that is surrounding us here in the city. So I'm just wondering if you had experiences meeting similar persons, you had a chance to talk to them, or how did you put together the person yourself?
Yeah, I mean, no, there was no one person who was a model for István. That's for sure. I think, I mean, and least of all myself. I mean, I bear very little resemblance to him, except in the most kind of fundamental human ways. I think the point you make about the book being about a bigger social phenomenon, though, especially in the last 20 years, with Hungary and other countries in the region, and the relationship that has developed between those countries and Western European societies through the sort of very large-scale migration of people from east to west, not only to this country, but obviously to Germany and Holland, wherever, all over Western Europe, really. That was something that I wanted to write about. I think that that's a major fact of life in contemporary Europe. It affects both the societies that the people leave and the societies to which they come. And as I say, I have a cousin who bears absolutely no resemblance to István at all. But except that she moved from Hungary to England at about the time that Hungary joined the EU, and she has made a very successful, stable life for herself here. But so it meant that I knew from knowing her, and I had sort of quite close experience of the kind of the psychology of that move of I wouldn't presume to say that I understand her exactly or anything like that, but I knew people, not only her, but then actually in Hungary, I met many more people who had virtually every Hungarian I met under the age of 40 seemed to have done some time somewhere in Western Europe, and many of them obviously didn't stay there, came back for whatever reason, but it was almost like a sort of rite of passage for young Hungarians at that time. And so then I became acquainted with other sort of people who had done that, and so the whole thing just became very interesting. So when I wanted to write a book that had both an English and a Hungarian aspect to it, writing about a Hungarian who emigrates to England seemed like the most obvious story to tell, since I also wanted to write something that had a very contemporary feel and was rooted in contemporary reality.
Well, Flash was praised at length for his stylistic rigor that we already referenced, and the book's structure, but it's definitely not lacking in action. It's made up of these almost separate little stories. And I felt that many of the debate that the book has stirred is actually in these like cuts where we don't know what happened to István. But there's a lot of tension in the book still. You know that something has happened because he moved places, for example.
Yes.
So a lot of the debates that is around that, the graveness of István's trauma, the toxic masculinity question, sex and power, and the crisis of male agency, arises from what you leave out. And you're very cautious about not to offer any interpretations. There's a lot of unspoken action, but there are clear developments. So what were your principles? How did you calibrate that distance? What you would leave to the reader? Yeah.
I mean, it was quite an instinctive thing, I think. It wasn't something that was very sort of planned in a sort of intellectual or sort of consciously thought out way. I knew what the basic arc of the story would be from from the beginning, essentially. I mean, that was established very early in the process of writing the book, which is how I would normally work, just to know really roughly what happens in the whole book at the point where I begin writing it. So that was all in place. And so then it was just a question of, after writing each episode of the book, and as you say, the book is episodic, each chapter is almost a sort of self-contained piece of writing. After writing each one, I would then just sort of, it was just a matter of sort of instinct almost, as I say, or just sort of how I would begin the next bit, what I would go to next, and how I would start writing about it. Was just a question of, it was just what I wanted to write next. And for instance, in the bit that I read, which is the beginning of the third chapter, where it's the beginning of the section of the book that deals with István's time in the army and his experience in Iraq. And I think probably many readers of the book outside Hungary wouldn't even be aware that there were Hungarians in Iraq, that Hungary was in fact involved in that. But of course it was in a small way. And but when it came to write that, I was doing some research about how that worked, because obviously I didn't know anything about it from first-hand experience. And the thing which sort of hooked me in terms of how to begin this was the simple fact that I encountered as I was reading about it, that the soldiers who went in and out of Iraq, all of the nationalities who were on the sort of American side there, would go in and out via Kuwait. They would be flown into Kuwait and enter Iraq overland, and then when they left, the reverse. And so for some reason, I just immediately started imagining these kind of these boring in-transit sort of moments of just hanging around in Kuwait, waiting for a flight back to Europe or America or wherever. And that just seemed, that just sort of caught my imagination. So I didn't even think, is this really the best way to start it? That was what I wanted to write about. And that just seemed like a very good way into this story, or this part of the story, rather than beginning with something very sort of violent or dramatic, to begin with this boredom. And then, of course, you introduce these people, the characters, István and the other soldiers are introduced not as soldiers even. They're just in the first instance, they're just people next to a swimming pool. And then you gradually learn, only after a page or two does it become clear that they are in fact soldiers. And it's sort of, you get into the whole thing through sort of mundane, everyday detail, which is in a way what I like writing about more than anything else. And so this book is full of action in a way, and certainly it's full of very dramatic incident, but very often, almost always perhaps, the way into writing about that action and drama is through mundane detail and the sort of just the texture of everyday life, which is kind of always there, whatever else is going on.
Completing the series of the parallels of the story and the life of a Hungarian diplomat here, let us talk a little bit about the London setting of the story, because everything what was going on in London in the story, that's the neighborhood of the Hungarian embassy practically. So very familiar for many of us who work there. And I was wondering, the way you set the London part of the story, how did you like to describe the story's London aspect with the Chelsea setting, with the country house, or what? In what sense was it the reflection of your own London experiences, and what were your intentions with putting the story right into these settings, into those neighborhoods, and how did it work?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, István, when he first moves to London, he doesn't live in Chelsea; he lives in Ilford, and which is probably more typical as the kind of landing zone for Hungarians arriving in London in the last 20 years, But of course, he prospers, and his life moves west across London, and yes, he ends up living in Chelsea, and part of a very extremely wealthy sort of milieu. I wanted, of course, there was always going to be this thing of you know, it's sort of in a way it's a typical immigrant story of kind of prosperity and sort of living the dream of sort of coming to some sort of El Dorado like London and actually getting your hands on the money. And I thought I might as well do that to an extreme. You know, why stop at sort of just reasonably wealthy? Why not take this story into the kind of upper echelons of wealth and sort of see how that goes? And partly because it's interesting to write about that sort of extreme wealth, which incidentally I have no personal experience of. I had to do some research on that too. Although I did when I was a child, and Chelsea was much more affordable in those days. I did live not far from I also, when I was a child, went to Battersea Park and the playground there, and so I did know that area of London from my childhood, and so it was fun to write about that for me, just on a personal sort of nostalgic level. So yeah, I mean, there was that personal aspect in it too, and for me, as someone who London still feels more like home, I guess, than any other place for me. But because I haven't lived here for many years, there's a sort of slight gap, a slight complication to that. And to describe London through the eyes of someone who's a real outsider like István was a very interesting way for me to sort of it was just for me as someone who feels slightly distressingly like an outsider in London these days sometimes. It was interesting for me to write, to see the city, view the city imaginatively through the eyes of a genuine outsider.
You being an outsider in London, you spend quite a lot of time in London nowadays because you're doing your paperback tour, if I'm not mistaken. That's why you're here.
Yes, exactly. Next week I'll be very busy for most of the week.
So tell us what happened in the aftermath of winning the Booker Prize. What does the life of a Booker Prize winning author look like these days? Is it all interviews with Dua Lipa or storms?
that happened before the Booker Prize.
Right.
I don't know the Booker Prize absolutely everything, but no, of course it's been very tiring. I mean, it's like having a real job, frankly. It's you know, I have constant stream of sort of things to deal with. No, I mean, of course it's great, but it has been the first month or two, the sort of the end of last year was very busy. I did quite a lot of traveling. A lot of that traveling was already there before I won the prize, actually, but it had a new sort of intensity, and there was an extra level of interest because of that. And then I deliberately I kind of carved out some free space for myself in January and February. So in fact, for the last couple of months, I haven't been doing that much. Trying to actually do some writing, in fact, because I'm halfway through a new book, which I'm quite enjoying working on when I have a moment to do it. But now, starting now with this trip to London and going on for the next few months, there's really a lot going on. Also be going to the States, to Australia, to various other places. Promoting Flesh is very much my life at the moment.
It's a full-time job. Yes. I don't know if you had any
just one thing about the afterlife of the Orwell film adaptation. I read something about it. So can you tell us anything about the progress and how it's going to work out?
Yeah, the book has been optioned by House Productions, which is a London-based production company that made recently some very successful, well-known films like Conclave, for instance, and yeah, they've optioned it, and that doesn't, of course, mean that it's definitely going to get made, but I think there's a reasonable chance that it will, maybe a 50-50 chance that they will make the film. Obviously, there's a very long, this will be years. I mean, the film won't be sort of ready for several years, even if it does happen. But yeah, it's great. It's great.
We will see how István looks like.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's
after all.
Obviously, there's a lot of, well, actually, and this is interesting. The director of the film, because if it does get made, the director who will do it is already sort of attached to it. He's very keen. He's a German director. He's very keen that the parts of the story that are set in Hungary should be in Hungarian with subtitles, which means, of course, that you need a Hungarian actor.
Worked for the brutalist. Good work.
No, well, but wasn't that sort of AI dubbing, and wasn't there sort of an issue with
that involved?
There was. I mean, I think this guy, the director for this, he really wants, he wants the Hungarian bits to be totally authentic in Hungarian, filmed in Hungary, probably, and therefore with Hungarian actors, at least for István's mother, and so on. So. Yes, if the film does indeed get made along those lines, then the film will have, in a way, an even stronger Hungarian connection than the book does.
Well, thank you. As I mentioned, the book leaves quite a bit of room for personal interpretations, and I'm sure that the audience has loads of questions for you. So now we have time for a few, and my colleague will pass around the mic.
Well, thank you very much, David, for your delightfully simple novel, which I'm sure is very difficult to write such a thing. My question was about the cinematic influence you may have had on before you actually wrote the novel, because there are lots of aspects that I feel are very cinematic and shown but not exposited, as it were. And I didn't know that it was optioned, but could you tell us a little bit about any cinematic influence, please? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think most novels these days, maybe all you could say, are very influenced by film and also TV, by the sort of narrative methods, just by the sort of way one imagines a story these days. It's impossible to do it without doing it somewhat in terms of how a film or a TV version would be, because we're just so conditioned by that. That sort of visual storytelling is kind of the dominant narrative form of our culture now. And so I think that the influence of film and TV on narrative, on storytelling is pervasive. I don't think it's very strange with Flesh, because on the one hand it seems to be such a sort of story about externals, about surfaces, about things that you can touch and see. So in that sense, it seems like something which would very, very naturally and almost effortlessly go onto a film. But at the same time, I think that there's a quality to it that somehow doesn't reside in those externals. And I think if that quality is an essential part of it somehow, and I'm not, even myself, I'm not quite sure what that is. But it's. I mean, a good example is the way that István isn't described, or it's an obvious example. But it's so István has this, I hope, very intense reality for the reader without being visually described and specified. And I think the whole book has something like that. It has this very intense, almost physical reality, but at the same time, there's something else very important there as well, something that wouldn't be conveyed simply by filming exactly what's described page by page. So I think it will be quite difficult, surprisingly difficult, to make a film of it which captures that quality. But I of course it's possible, and I hope that they succeed.
Thank you very much. We talked a lot about the Hungarian part, but to me, this first part of the novel could have been anywhere. You don't name any cities, you don't name, I mean, we just love that it's in Hungary, I think. I'm very proud. Hungarians are, perhaps you know that. But to me, this was not so important. And in fact, you don't even say, the names of the people, István, almost just a few friends who, the lady's husband. There's not much information about the actual towns or places he goes to. Yet when he lands in London, it's almost like a different novel is starting. Then the novel to me, it came alive. Like I've heard that what you just said, that you feel home mostly still here, because you then describe places and almost streets and roads, which was completely missing in the other parts. Was that something you did consciously, or would it just happen like that?
I mean, I think the book is, if the book is about a place, it's about London. it is finally a novel that's more about London than about. It's not really about Hungary as a place. I kind of agree with that. I think that. So yeah, there's that. I mean, and also maybe I was more confident about writing about London than about Hungary. Although, you know, when the book was finished and before it was published, I obviously showed the text of it to Hungarian friends from Pécs, and because I was a bit worried, you know, that about the sort of authenticity of how authentic that part of the book felt and how authentic István felt to a Hungarian reader. And I hope they weren't just being nice, but they assured me that it felt authentic and that they thought it was fine. But you're right that there is maybe when it comes to London, there is suddenly a more concrete specificity. And obviously I didn't name that. I mean, most Hungarians I think would recognize that the town that István comes from is in fact Pécs. But I didn't name it partly, and I didn't name it partly out of a sort of feeling that I didn't want to have lots of people coming up to me and kind of correcting my, you know, saying, no, that's wrong, because in Pécs, that street goes there. And because, and that reflects a kind of lack of confidence maybe in portraying Pécs compared to the confidence I had in portraying London. I think also, though, it reflects the fact that the story, when it's set in Hungary at the beginning, it's the story of, in the first instance, an adolescent, and adolescence is kind of the same everywhere, and I guess that you know the exactly where it was taking place wasn't so important as in that part as the parts that take place in London could only happen in London or few similar big cities. But no, I mean, I think there is some truth in what you say, for sure. Yeah.
The book is like very closely on István's perspective the whole way through, which I think is very much the point. But very occasionally I sort of noticed that you came out of it and for just a few scenes or pages to like focus on some other characters. I think maybe like Helen and Thomas have a conversation. I thought that was an interesting thing, but I couldn't really work out why you were doing it. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that. Yeah,
I mean, exactly. It's from István's perspective with a few brief exceptions. And I was I guess, a bit concerned about, or I felt that I was aware of that, of course. And I felt, you know, that those exceptions, I left them in because I felt that they were somehow important, that they were doing something which would be difficult or kind of awkward to do any other way. And they provided sort of perspectives and additional sort of information and context on István's life that was important. But I didn't, the way it's written, I very much tried to be discreet about that, so that to try and kind of make sure that the reader didn't feel a kind of big sort of clunk when it moved perspective and when it kind of went back to István quite soon after. In a way, a kind of perfectly disciplined novel that was committed to István's perspective would have somehow found a way to do those things without departing from his perspective. But I don't. I hope it's not. I hope it works. I think I don't regret sort of doing that, and I think that those bits bring something that would be impossible in a way to bring otherwise to it.
I was wondering, what was the biggest challenge that you faced during the creative process of writing this book?
I think the biggest challenge in a way was, I mean, this is quite a sort of lengthy answer, and I'd abandoned another book, shortly before beginning this book. I mean, a book that I'd been working on for, a year or two. And I'd written a lot of this book, the abandoned book. And so abandoning the book was the right thing to do, and I felt a great relief when I did that. And you know, that was all great. But then, of course, starting a new book after that, there was a lot of pressure. I mean, I couldn't abandon another book, so it was very important that this time it worked. So that I felt more pressure, I think, then than I ever have writing anything. And that did make it quite tough at the beginning of writing this book. It was a difficult process of sort of dealing with the sort of blow to confidence of abandoning a book and trying to sort of then write something which was good. And that probably did influence the nature of this book in some way. I think part of the reason that this book is so focused on the sort of physicality of life, for instance, part of the reason for that is that just, when I began writing it, I wanted to feel that I was writing about something sort of really concrete, something that wouldn't, because with the abandoned book, the problem had been with the basic ideas of the book had been the root of the problem, which was why it was impossible to sort of fix it, if you like. So writing about life as a physical experience seemed to be writing about something which was sort of irreducible and which at least as a subject was not going to sort of slip away. So in all kinds of ways it affected this book, and that made the beginning of writing this book, the first few months, if you like, or whatever, of writing this book, one of the most difficult, in terms of writing, one of the most difficult parts of my life, I think, yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you like to describe large events through mundane things. I just wanted to understand, what do you think that mundane things can, I guess, evoke in people that, say, making a large splash wouldn't do? Just that's all.
No, I mean, definitely. I mean, for instance, the thing about, the writing about his experience of the war, for example, I felt very strongly that the best way of doing that, the best way of conveying the impact of that experience, which is very dramatic, very unusual, very extraordinary, was to approach it through kind of banality almost. I think that somehow puts it in a context that makes its extraordinariness and its violence seem more than they would if you were putting it in a context, any other context. And I think that recurs throughout the book. I mean, all of these, the book contains, as I say, quite extreme, quite dramatic, almost melodramatic events. And I think one of the reasons why hopefully it doesn't become a kind of melodrama itself is because the constant emphasis when talking about these things on kind of everyday life, the kind of mundane texture of everyday existence, puts these things in a context that makes them feel real and therefore makes them more impactful emotionally and imaginatively.
You said you kind of struggled for a few months there when you were getting started. Did you have sort of like a North Star to keep you on it? Sort of like, an image that kept coming back to your mind, or a scene that you were getting to, or a song, or just something that kind of anchored you a little bit?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I actually, during those difficult months that I mentioned, I effectively abandoned this book too a few times. I wrote some and then thought, no, this actually isn't working. Let's put it aside. But I would keep coming back to it. Every time I sort of panicked and put it aside, I would come back to it a few weeks later maybe and look at it again and think, actually, no, this is quite good. So, it was just more a sort of gradual process of it wouldn't let go of me. I kept wanting to go back to it, deciding that actually it was worth pushing a bit further, and then panicking again and putting it aside and then going back. I went through that probably several times, that cycle. And then obviously eventually it sort of got into its stride and it was clear that I was going to have to see this through to the end. The emphasis on physicality kind of kept it real, kept it sort of, that always told me how to approach it and sort of what to do with it in a way. But it was a complicated thing, and it was a bumpy start. But yeah.
My question is not so much about Flesh, but basically what's next and life as a Booker-winning author. I guess my question is, does that international acclaim, and congratulations on the award, by the way, is it something that would make an author, for the next projects, does it make you kind of burst with confidence and the words just keep flowing? Or is it something that's more of a writer's block of, is it going to be as successful, as well received?
Definitely the second one.
And what's next? I mean, we had 23 years between Imre Kertész and László Krasznahorkai, so do we have to wait 23 years?
Well, at least I would say, yeah. No, luckily I was already halfway through a new book when the prize was awarded, because obviously I finished writing Flesh nearly 3 years ago, because it was published first about a year ago. But of course, there's a long lead time of editing and, all that. So it was sort of, I submitted it to the publisher probably in sort of the autumn of 2023 or something. So by the time it won the prize, I was already halfway through a new book. And I'm very glad that was the case, because it meant that I'm not now facing a blank page and the kind of pressure of sort of repeating the trick. So no, I'm halfway through something, so I'm trying just to go back to that, carry on as if nothing had happened, just shut everything out. But of course it does, it interferes. I mean, in a way it makes you feel confident, but that confidence can kind of be treacherous, because, the last thing you want is to think that everything you write is brilliant, because, obviously that's the road to writing rubbish. So it's a tricky one. I mean, when I was shortlisted but didn't win in 2016, I said, when asked about that, I said, and I was only half joking or less than half joking, that I was glad I hadn't won in a way, because it meant that it would sort of keep me sharp. It would sort of prevent complacency about, creeping in. And now I've faced the possibility of that, and I'm kind of on my guard against it. But I don't know. It's not necessarily a blessing. I think very often Booker Prize winning writers, the Booker Prize in retrospect turns out to be, not always, but quite often turns out to be like the peak. So, yeah, who knows?
Okay, thank you. Kind of a wild card question for you. If you were to put on your hat as a Hungarian cultural ambassador, is there a Hungarian writer who inspires you and whom you would recommend to a non-Hungarian audience?
I mean, my favorite Hungarian novel is probably Fatelessness by Imre Kertész. I mean, that's probably one of my favorite novels, full stop. I mean, I think that's an extraordinary, unforgettable book, about a subject on which so much has been said. So for him to say something about it which is different, and from what, it feels different. And, is that, I mean, it's hardly an obscure hidden gem. I mean, he's a Nobel Prize winner, but...
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Well, so we're quickly gonna switch gears for some book signing. And as I mentioned, the copies are available from Primrose Hill Books. And I do encourage everyone to check out our book salon on the first floor, which is unfortunately closed now. But it is open every day from 4 p.m., I think. So please come back and check out some world-class Hungarian literature, translated and untranslated. And for everyone who came here for the first time, please give us a follow on Instagram. We're Hungarian Culture UK. We would appreciate it. And yeah, thank you. Thank you, David.